His boots clicked in perfect rhythm across the black mat. 21 steps, pause, turn, repeat, while dawn mist drifted through Arlington, and the marble of the tomb held the first pale light like a promise no season could break. Staff Sergeant Keith Volkov moved as if the cold had no claim on him. November wind crossed the hill in narrow, disciplined bands, pressing against his coat, tugging at the edges of breath rising from the waiting crowd, but his line never wavered. He was 6'2" and built like a wall that had learned to walk upright, shoulders square under a uniform so exact it looked engineered rather than sewn. Every crease was sharp enough to cut glass. Brass shone. White gloves remained pristine against the wood, and steel of the M14 balanced at his shoulder. His kepi sat at a precise angle that looked effortless only to people who had never learned what effort cost. The world around him softened to silence and detail. Rows of white headstones descended the slope in patient geometry, each one catching a stripe of weak morning light, each one a name, a date, a fragment of a life cut into stone. Far below, a flag stirred, then settled, then stirred again. The marble sarcophagus of the unknowns stood before him with its carved wreaths and clean lines, pale against the darker mat, permanent against weather, time, and forgetting. The hill carried that strange Arlington stillness, part air and part oath, where conversation never fully rose above a murmur because everyone sensed they had stepped into ground that answered to something higher than noise. A school group stood behind the rope line, high school students in jackets stamped with their district crest, phones lowered without being told. A few held notebooks against their chests. One boy with braces and freckled cheeks leaned slightly forward each time Keith turned, trying to count under his breath, lips moving silently through the cadence. Beside the students, an elderly Marine in a faded Chosin reservoir cap gripped a black cane with weathered knuckles and stood straighter than his hips wanted to allow. His wife, short and steady in a wool coat with a service pin at the lapel, kept one hand tucked at his elbow, not to hold him up, but to stand with him in the way people stand with a vow they both understand. 2 rows back, a young mother adjusted a blanket over her daughter's knees in a wheelchair, then pulled the blanket smooth with a careful palm as if preparing for inspection herself. The child's eyes stayed fixed on the sentinel's boots, following each polished arc of motion with complete concentration. On the other side of the path, a middle-aged veteran with hearing aids and a Purple Heart cap removed his gloves, folded them once, and tucked them into his coat pocket before placing his bare hand over his heart. A pair of tourists who had arrived talking in normal voices gradually fell quiet, then quiet enough to hear the heel strike on mat and the small metallic whisper when the rifle shifted from one shoulder to the other. Keith heard all of it, not as distraction, as information. To the crowd he looked carved from stone, face unreadable, eyes fixed on a point only he could see. Inside, his awareness moved in widening circles, measuring distance, movement, posture, intent. A child stepping too close to the rope, a zipper being tugged in a coat pocket, a tripod leg that had not been fully locked, wind direction, moisture on the mat. He did not scan in jerks. He absorbed in planes, every angle accounted for without visible effort. Years in combat had taught him that danger usually announced itself in ordinary motions half a second before people admitted what they were seeing. Years in the old guard had taught him that anticipation was not paranoia when the mission was sacred. He reached his mark, stopped, faced east for the measured pause, turned with mechanical grace that was still somehow human, moved again. The cadence was older than him and would outlast him. That was the point. A father in a work jacket bent down to his son and whispered, "Count with me, buddy. Watch his feet." The boy nodded and counted silently on his fingers, then lost track and started over, eyes widening when Keith executed the turn with exact, snapping precision. "He doesn't miss," the father whispered. "No, sir," the Marine in the Chosin cap said quietly, not taking his eyes from the mat. "He doesn't." The father glanced toward him, noticed the cap, and gave a brief, respectful nod. "Thank you for your service." The older man gave the smallest nod back. "Thank him now," he said, chin tilting toward Keith. "He's carrying all of us this morning." No one argued. The wind sharpened around 6:10 a.m., cutting from the river and lifting the mist so the top rows of markers appeared to rise from a cloud. In that thin silver light, Keith's jawline scar showed for a moment when he turned, a pale, narrow burn line along the left side, visible only at the right angle, and gone again when shadow returned. A teenage girl in the school group noticed it and looked at her teacher, eyebrows raised in a question she did not ask aloud. The teacher, a civics instructor with a navy scarf and tired eyes, pressed a finger gently to her own lips and then to her chest, the universal classroom sign for pay attention, with your whole self. Keith completed another cycle. The rifle remained steady, his grip exact, the heel of each boot touching down with identical force. Tourists often called the movement ceremonial, as if ceremony meant decoration. Here, ceremony meant discipline, tested so many times it became language. Each step spoke of continuity. Each pause made room for the absent. Each turn rejected the idea that memory could be casual. Behind the school group, two men in business coats arrived late and stopped when they realized they had entered mid-watch. One of them began to speak, saw others standing motionless, and shut his mouth on the first syllable. The second man removed his hat without glancing around to see whether anyone was watching. They stood shoulder to shoulder, as strangers do in places where everyone is briefly enlisted into the same silence. A grounds technician crossed the distant edge of the plaza carrying a maintenance case and kept his own movement low and careful, never intruding on the ceremonial axis. Even work crews adjusted their pace here. Even practical tasks seemed to obey the cadence. Keith reached the north end, executed the turn, and stepped back through the center line. The marble face of the tomb glowed brighter as the sun strengthened behind cloud. The carved inscription remained in shadow at first, then emerged letter by letter as light shifted, a slow reveal that felt less like illumination than witness. The child in the wheelchair raised her right hand in a tentative imitation of a salute, fingers not perfectly aligned, elbow uncertain, concentration absolute. Her mother noticed, brushed a loose strand of hair behind the girl's ear, and whispered, "That's beautiful, Em." The girl kept her hand up another second, then lowered it, and asked softly, "Does he ever stop?" "Not while he's on watch," her mother said. "Even if it's raining?" "Even then. Even at night. Especially at night." The girl took that in with solemn gravity beyond her years and looked back to Keith as if she had just discovered a definition. 21 steps, pause, turn, repeat. Keith's breathing stayed measured, invisible. His hands never tightened. His neck muscles remained loose beneath the discipline. The uniform did not wear him. He inhabited it with the calm of someone who understood exactly why each thread mattered. The tomb guard identification badge on his chest was small, severe, and easy to miss from a distance, but those who knew recognized what it meant. Standards exceeded, errors corrected, traditions absorbed until they became reflex. No shortcuts survived that process. No vanity did either, only commitment. A younger veteran near the back, one sleeve pinned at the shoulder, shifted his weight, and quietly said to no one in particular, "He makes it look easy." A woman beside him, perhaps his sister by resemblance, answered without looking away, "Looks expensive, too. All that polish, all that ceremony." The one-armed veteran shook his head once. "No. Looks earned." Keith heard the exchange carried on the wind and kept moving. By 6:24, the mist had lifted enough for the hillside to stretch clear in both directions. A long field of names and service emblems, Christian crosses and stars of David, and simple markers with only rank and date, lives from every state and every decade, folded into one terrain of memory. The crowd had grown without noise. Families arrived pushing strollers and then parked them at a respectful distance. A man with a camera lowered it after one picture and simply watched. A woman with a folded program held it to her chest like a hymn sheet. The school group stood in tighter formation now, less from instruction than from instinct, as if the place itself corrected posture. Keith completed another pass and turned. Under the discipline, a private current moved through him, a litany without words. Names carried, promises kept, hours stood, weather endured, standards upheld for men he had known and men he had never met. The unknowns were not abstractions to him. They were obligation made stone. Their anonymity was not emptiness. It was representation, the final rank of those whose stories ended before anyone could bring them home with certainty. He had volunteered for this post because uncertainty deserved a guardian too. The Marine in the faded cap lifted his hand in a crisp old salute as Keith crossed center line, a motion shaped by muscle memory older than the students in the front row. Keith did not break cadence, could not, but at the next turn his bearing shifted by a fraction, so subtle most would miss it. The acknowledgement lived there in that fraction, in alignment rather than gesture, in professionalism so exact it became respect. No speeches filled the morning, no amplified narration, only boots on mat, wind over stone, occasional whisper, and the collective attention of people who had remembered, for a few measured minutes, that freedom had a maintenance schedule, and that someone had to keep it. At 6:31, another watch cycle carried Keith past the center again. The sunlight reached fully across the tomb face at last, and the marble looked less cold than resolute, white against the receding mist, unadorned and absolute. The crowd held its silence as if silence itself were part of the ceremony. Keith took the 21st step, paused on the mark, and turned with perfect control into the next passage, unwavering beneath the flag that moved above him like a steady pulse. At 6:32, his right heel struck the mat again, and the sound carried across marble and mist with the certainty of a metronome set by history itself. 21 steps, pause, turn, repeat. The school group stayed still, no teacher command needed now. The elderly Marine in the Chosin cap shifted his cane to his left hand, spine straight as a rifle stock. Emma Rivera watched with her small chin raised, blanket tucked to her knees, her father's folded patrol cap held against her chest like something warm. Keith Volkov moved through another pass with the same unbroken precision, his face a disciplined mask, his eyes fixed forward, while his awareness tracked every motion at the perimeter. At 6:40, the wind eased and the hill grew brighter, but the gravity of the place did not soften. A park ranger guided late arrivals into a respectful line without words, only a palm-down gesture and a nod. Two veterans with different wars in their posture stood shoulder to shoulder and did not speak. A mother hushed an infant by lowering herself to one knee, rocking in silence so the child could feel the cadence through her instead of hearing it over the hush. Keith marked his turn and stepped back through center line, boots polished to a mirror shine, rifle angle exact, white gloves pristine. To most eyes, he looked ceremonial. To trained eyes, he looked mission-ready. By 6:49, relief had arrived at the edge of the mat in immaculate form, another sentinel waiting for the transfer, with the same severe composure, the same reverence pressed into every thread. The inspection and exchange unfolded like liturgy, measured, exacting, beyond vanity. Keith yielded the post without yielding presence. When he stepped clear of the ceremonial axis, he did not relax. He transitioned. His jaw scar caught a thin stripe of light, then vanished under the brim of his kepi. Emma lifted her hand again in a careful salute as he passed the rope line. This time her fingers aligned better. Keith gave the smallest nod, one disciplined acknowledgement to a military child who understood more than many adults did. Her mother leaned toward him. "Staff Sergeant, thank you." He stopped at regulation distance, posture still formal. "Ma'am?" "They said we might lose the school transport program." Her voice stayed low, respectful, but strain threaded every syllable. "Kids like her don't get here without it." Keith held her gaze for one calm second. "I'm testifying this morning." Emma looked up at him. "At the big building?" "At the Capitol, yes?" "Tell them to keep it." His expression did not break, but something in his eyes sharpened with private oath. "I intend to." At 6:58, he was in transit, Arlington receding behind him in orderly rows of white stone and winter grass, Washington ahead beneath a hard, pale sky. He sat in dress blues in the back seat of a government sedan, cap centered on his knees, gloves aligned thumb to thumb. Across from him sat retired Colonel Miriam Kane, campaign ribbons precise on civilian wool, silver hair pinned back, gaze steady as an operations map. She had watched him on the plaza with the quiet intensity of someone who knew the true cost of composure. "They're calling it streamlining," she said, eyes on a briefing folder thick with tabs. "They usually do," Keith answered. Kane flipped one page. "Night maintenance deferred. Ceremonial staffing reduced. Youth transport grants folded into discretionary outreach. It's a procedural trap." Keith looked out the window as the car crossed the river. "Who drafted the language?" "Senator Dalton Reeves' office." He said nothing after that. He did not need to. By 7:21, the Senate Appropriations hearing room had filled beyond listed capacity. Cameras nested on tripods between columns. Staffers moved in clipped diagonals with binders hugged tight. Reporters in dark coats whispered into earpieces and checked live feeds. In the public gallery, veterans in old unit caps sat beside policy interns with legal pads. A teacher from Emma's school stood with 3 students in borrowed blazers. Families with military pins occupied the back row where wheelchairs could fit without blocking aisles. Emma and her mother were there too, near the rail, patrol caps still in the child's lap. The room smelled faintly of coffee, wool and old paper warmed by lights. Keith took his witness seat in full uniform, spine vertical, shoulders level, ribbon rack immaculate, tomb badge small and severe against his chest. Under camera glare, his brass did not glitter. It held. He folded his hands once on the table and waited. To observers unfamiliar with him, he looked like ceremony brought indoors, an emblem set in a chair for optics. What they could not see was the operating system under that stillness. 3 combat tours worth of threat pattern recognition. Discipline sharpened in places where one wrong read cost lives, and a refusal to mistake volume for authority. At 7:29, Senator Dalton Reeve entered with practiced momentum and the confidence of a man accustomed to rooms adjusting around him. His suit was charcoal, cut razor clean, silver cufflinks catching every camera pan. He greeted no one in the gallery. He dropped a thick amendment packet on the dais and smiled for the press angle that favored his left side. Reeve had built a national profile on deficit language and televised it certainty, branding cuts as courage and ritual as waste. His staff called him efficient. His donors called him presidential. Veterans who had followed his votes used a different vocabulary in private, but private language carried no microphone. The gavel struck once. Proceedings open. Witnesses were sworn. Reeve waited through opening statements with visible impatience, pen tapping a clipped rhythm against a folder marked Emergency Transit Adjustments. Then he asked for recognition, rose halfway from his chair, and launched the package as if unveiling a rescue plan. "This committee has a duty to taxpayers," he said, voice smooth and amplified. "Every line item must prove mission value. Symbolic overhead can no longer outrank operational necessity." He turned one page. "Accordingly, my efficiency package reduces excess ceremonial staffing, pauses non-essential overnight maintenance allocations, and consolidates youth access transport under broader educational channels." A murmur moved through the gallery and died fast when the chair raised a hand. Reeve pressed on. "Let's be candid. We are not defunding national defense. We are trimming performance costs." Colonel Kane's jaw tightened by a fraction. Keith did not move. Reeve looked directly at the witness table, then at Keith, and gave a camera-ready half-smile that never reached his eyes. "Staff Sergeant Volkov, no disrespect intended, but this chamber cannot subsidize nostalgia forever. We appreciate your service, truly, but we're not here to fund parade optics." Silence struck the room like a sealed door. He leaned back, cufflinks flashing, and finished the line that would follow him long after the hearing adjourned. "A parade prop in expensive shoes should not dictate federal priorities." The gallery froze. Not figuratively, physically. A reporter's pen stopped mid-word. One student in the second row held his breath so long his shoulders shook. Emma's fingers tightened around her father's cap until her knuckles blanched. The elderly Marine from Arlington, now seated near the aisle, stared at the dais with a face gone completely still, the kind of stillness that preceded either command or grief. Keith remained upright at the witness table, expression unreadable, breathing measured, eyes level. What Reeve did not know was not small. He did not know that the man he had just labeled decorative had dragged wounded soldiers through mortar smoke in Afghanistan, then returned for 2 more under active fire. He did not know Keith had learned to detect panic by the angle of a shoulder and violent intent by the timing of a glance. He did not know a thin scar along that left jawline came from heat and shrapnel in a vehicle strike that should have ended his watch forever. He did not know discipline at the tomb was not pageantry, but consecrated restraint, the controlled edge of a warrior who had chosen duty over display. He did not know the room had just crossed a line. The pause that followed felt engineered by providence and politics in equal measure. Staffers shifted papers but did not yet distribute vote cards. Camera operators checked framing while pretending not to look rattled. On the dais, 2 senators exchanged a glance that carried procedural alarm. Reeve's amendment text had been moved fast, folded into transit language dense enough to slide past inattentive eyes. In the third row, Colonel Kane opened her folder to a flagged page and drew one steady breath through her nose, the breath of a commander identifying a flank attack in time to counter it. Keith kept his hands folded. Inside, his awareness widened. He tracked exits, stair angles, aid traffic, the cable run near the public rail, the distance between Emma's chair and the nearest rush lane. He registered the parliamentarian conferring with committee counsel at whisper level. He clocked Senator Eleanor Ward entering the side corridor outside the chamber doors, reserve colonel bearing unmistakable, even in a civilian suit, folder under her arm thick with margin notes. The institutional clock above the rear arch clicked toward 7:34, each second narrowing options. In the gallery, whispers tried to start and failed. Did he really just... One intern breathed, then stopped when a veteran beside him murmured, "Watch." Emma looked from her mother to Keith and back again, searching adult faces for meaning. Her mother bent close and said, "Stay with me, baby. Just stay with me." The child nodded, eyes wide but steady, both hands now on her patrol cap as if anchoring herself to her father across the years. At 7:35, a page stepped into the center aisle with the first stack of vote cards, and the room's temperature seemed to drop another degree. This was the hinge. Language buried in procedure could become law before outrage found a microphone. Reeves' expression had settled into practiced patience, the expression of a man certain the machinery favored him. He arranged his papers in neat columns and waited for compliance. Across from him sat a tomb guard whose profession had been to keep vigil through weather, darkness, and indifference, and who understood with painful clarity that what was being reduced here was not expense but remembrance. No one in the chamber spoke above a murmur. No one looked away from the witness table for long. The next movement would define the day. The next movement would define the day, and the room seemed to understand it before any senator spoke. The page in the center aisle held the vote cards with both hands, thumbs squared on the top edge, waiting for the clerk's nod. Camera tally lights glowed red. Wool coats brushed against varnished wood benches. A heating vent clicked behind the last row, then fell quiet again. And even that small sound felt intrusive against the held breath of veterans, interns, teachers, and military families packed shoulder to shoulder in the gallery. By 7:36, the hearing chamber had become its own kind of parade ground. Not because it held honor, but because everyone was measuring distance, timing, and consequence in tight, disciplined increments. Senator Reeves sat at the dais with his papers aligned to perfect corners, silver cufflinks bright against the dark table. Colonel Miriam Kane remained one row behind Keith, posture rigid, eyes on the amendment text as if she could burn through euphemism by stare alone. Emma Rivera's wheelchair sat near the public rail where staff had made room. Her mother kept one hand lightly on the push handle, the other on Emma's shoulder, a protective touch that was gentle and constant. Keith Volkoff did not shift. His dress blues held their geometry under television lights, seams straight, brass clean to a hard glow, service ribbons balanced in exact order, the tomb guard identification badge small and severe above his heart. His white gloves rested against the witness table, fingertips aligned, no tremor, no fidget. The kepi brim cast a narrow shadow across his eyes, and that shadow made him look even more remote to people who did not know him. To those who did, the stillness meant he was calculating every angle in the room. He used ritual to control pulse. He counted without moving his lips, not senators, not votes, steps, 21. In his mind, the hearing room floor flattened into the black mat before the tomb, and the sterile light of the chamber gave way to dawn over Arlington, where the cold entered the lungs clean and sharp, and the wind moved down the hill in long, even currents. He could smell wet grass under November air, stone holding overnight chill, a hint of metal polish on wool cuffs. He could hear the true metronome. Heel strike on mat, pause, turn, repeat, the language of duty spoken through boots and breath. Arlington had not been abstract to him that morning. It had been tactile, immediate, dense with human detail. The headstones had stood in disciplined rows like a formation that never broke, white markers stepping down the slope in patient lines that met the horizon and seemed to continue beyond it. The tomb's marble had taken first light slowly, from gray to pearl to a pale brightness that made the carved wreaths stand out in relief. Mist had lingered at knee level in pockets, drifting around shoes and wheelchair rims, then lifting as the sun climbed, as if the ground itself were exhaling names. The crowd had formed in layers the way memory always did there. The school children in district jackets had arrived with the restless energy of teenagers, and then quieted one by one, phones lowering, shoulders setting, chatter dissolving into attention. A boy with a freckled face had counted under his breath and lost track and started again, determined to match the cadence. A civics teacher with a navy scarf had watched her students instead of the sentinel for a while, making sure they understood where they were, then turned back to the mat with damp eyes she never wiped. Near the rope line, the elderly Marine in the Chosin cap had leaned into his cane, but refused to lean away from the ceremony. His wife had stood close enough to steady him without diminishing him, both of them reading Keith's movement with the fluency of people who knew uniform weight from the inside. A younger veteran with one sleeve pinned had stood nearby, jaw set, his sister beside him, with a program folded twice in her gloved hand. Behind them, tourists who began as spectators had become witnesses in silence, hats removed, conversations abandoned mid-sentence. Emma had been at the center of Keith's peripheral map all morning, not because she demanded attention, but because she carried reverence with both hands around her father's folded patrol cap. She had tracked each pass of his boots with uncompromising focus. When she tried to salute the first time, uncertain fingers and all, he had seen in that small effort the entire reason the youth transport line item mattered. Without that bus, without that program, children like her would be taught remembrance by slideshow and textbook, not by cold air and marble and the rhythm of a living watch. He remembered the exact bite of the wind at 6:10, the way it cut across his jaw and found the old burn line along the left side of his face. He remembered the brief, weightless second at each turn, when the world narrowed to balance and intent. He remembered the discipline of his relief at 6:49, inspection unfolding with sacred precision, while families and veterans watched in complete stillness, each detail proving that the uniform was not a costume, but covenant. Every crease had been sharp enough to cut glass. Every button had been checked and rechecked. His boots had reflected the mat. His gloves had remained pristine against the M14 stock. Nothing in that ritual existed for vanity. Every element existed to communicate that the dead were not unattended. In the hearing room, a clerk whispered to another clerk. Papers changed hands, and the fluorescent hum returned to the foreground. Keith opened his eyes a fraction wider. The memory did not distract him. It centered him. The chamber might call the tomb symbolic overhead, but he had stood in weather before sunrise while a nation's cross-section watched in silence, and he knew what symbols did when they were embodied instead of advertised. They taught posture. They taught continuity. They taught a child how to hold a salute when her father's hand was no longer there to guide it. The page took one step toward the first row. A senator coughed into a fist. Colonel Kane turned a flag page and held it ready. Reeve adjusted his microphone stem by a half-inch, impatient for process to validate contempt. Keith remained composed, but the biographical weight behind that composure ran deep enough to drown rhetoric. He had entered the army at 19 with shoulders already broad and purpose less defined than resolve. His first Afghanistan tour placed him in Kunar province, steep country where ridgelines cut radio coverage and every patrol felt like walking inside a drawn breath. He learned the terrain the hard way. Shale under boots, dust in teeth, villages where children watched from doorways while elders weighed every promise. He learned to read alleys, rooftops, and silence. He learned that fear was not the shaking in your hands. Fear was the urge to rush, and discipline was refusing it. Noah Mercer arrived in that first tour as the platoon medic who carried gauze, sarcasm, and a permanent talent for reducing tension 2 seconds before it became panic. He was from Missouri, talked with quick warmth, and could turn an MRE spoon into a comedy prop on command. In a Kandahar chow tent during Keith's second tour, when a tray slid and splattered potatoes across his own boots, Noah saluted the mess line and said, "If I trip with this tray again, Volkov, tell command I died storming enemy mashed potatoes." The whole table laughed, including Keith, who almost never did in uniform. Humor mattered because the work did not permit sentimentality. During that second Afghanistan rotation, mortar rounds landed inside a district compound while Keith's element moved casualties to cover. He crossed open ground 3 times under fragment spray, carrying one wounded soldier and dragging another by plate carrier straps, when the smoke thickened and comms clipped in and out. He did not remember deciding to do it. Training and loyalty moved first, thought caught up later. The Bronze Star citation called it conspicuous gallantry under fire. Keith called it Tuesday, with better luck than some. Syria came after Afghanistan. A different map and a different texture of risk. Advisory missions near hard desert towns meant long stretches of apparent calm broken by sudden violence. Convoys ran narrow routes where roadside debris had to be read like language. It was there, outside a shattered industrial corridor, that a vehicle strike through heat and pressure, through steel and glass. Keith came out with ringing ears, a jawline burn from flash and fragments, and a scar that never fully faded. 2 men in his vehicle came out alive because the crew reacted fast, and the medic in the back seat did not freeze. That medic was Noah. Weeks later, near the edge of a market district where local interpreters were helping de-conflict civilian movement, contact erupted from an upper window line. The team moved to cover families and pull their partnered interpreter back behind an armored corner. Noah got there first. He put his body between danger and the interpreter, bought the second that let others move, and paid for it in full. There was no cinematic speech, no final monologue, no dramatic camera angle. There was noise, dust, commands, and then a silence that settled into Keith's chest and never left. Grief in uniform followed procedures. Notifications, effects inventory, folded flags, signatures where signatures were required. Keith completed them all. He also carried one private artifact. Noah's habit of making fears smaller, so others could stand taller. That memory did not soften loss. It sharpened obligation. When Keith later requested assignment toward the old guard track, people outside that world assumed he wanted prestige. People inside it understood something else. Tomb duty was not easier than combat. It demanded another form of endurance, absolute precision under constant observation, hours of stillness in weather that ignored comfort, and a standard where a fraction of sloppiness meant disrespect measured against the unnamed dead. Keith chose it because anonymity at the tomb mirrored the anonymity of too many losses he had seen. Names mattered. So did the ones history never recovered. He wanted a post where remembrance was not annual, not performative, not optional. Training for the badge ground ego down to powder. Uniform prep became ritual science, thread count, crease line, brass polish, glove care, rifle manual exactness, step length measured and corrected until muscle memory erased variance. Instructors tolerated effort, but not excuses. Keith absorbed corrections without argument. He had already learned that discipline was love in professional form. Love for team, for mission, for those who could no longer defend their own dignity. In the hearing room, that entire history sat behind one motionless man in dress blues, while legislators framed memory as discretionary spending. The gallery saw posture. Colonel Kane saw a soldier holding his line. Emma saw the sentinel from dawn now seated beneath harsh lights, still guarding what mattered, only the terrain had changed from marble to procedure. At 7:38, the first vote cards began moving row to row. Keith's breathing remained steady, each inhale measured to count, each exhale controlled to calm the surge that came whenever duty and contempt collided. He had stood under mortar arcs and desert heat, under winter wind and public gaze. He had carried wounded men and buried friends. He had walked 21 steps for strangers whose names were lost to time. If this chamber wanted to test whether a tomb guard understood stakes, it had chosen the wrong man to underestimate. Senator Dalton Reeve had spent 15 years building his reputation on that same miscalculation and getting rewarded for it. He had come up through state finance committees where shuttered offices and trimmed payrolls looked clean on charts, then vaulted into national office by branding himself as the man willing to cut what everyone else was too sentimental to touch. He called it fiscal courage. News panels called it discipline. Donors called it leadership. The pattern underneath was simpler. He targeted institutions that could not shout back in campaign season, converted complexity into slogans, and treated reverence as a weakness in people who still believed some obligations sat above convenience. By 7:39, his staff had formed a quiet perimeter around the dais, each aide carrying a tablet, color-coded folders, and the composure of professionals who knew their principal liked speed more than consensus. Reeves' chief counsel, a narrow-shouldered attorney with rimless glasses, leaned in and whispered, "Transit language is still covered if Ward challenges relevance." Reeve gave a small nod without looking at him, eyes on the vote cards moving through committee rows. He had expected resistance from veterans groups, but he had modeled the resistance as noise, not leverage. In his framework, ceremony always lost to arithmetic eventually. He rose again when recognized, voice smooth, jaw relaxed, one hand resting on the amendment packet as if it were a harmless technical correction. "Let's remove theater from this debate," he said. "Our military's lethality does not depend on maintaining performative pageantry at legacy levels. We preserve what matters and modernize what doesn't." A hissed whisper came from the gallery. "Pageantry?" an older veteran muttered, then stopped when his wife squeezed his sleeve. Reeve turned a page and kept going. "The public should know what this line funds: duplicate ceremonial billets, overnight upkeep cycles with no measurable readiness return, and boutique bus routes under an outreach label that bypass normal educational grant channels." Emma's mother flinched at the phrase boutique bus routes, as if he had reached across the room and diminished her daughter by name. Colonel Kane did not move, but the tendon in her neck stood out in a thin line. Keith remained still at the witness table, shoulders square, eyes forward, his breath cycling in controlled increments that never reached his face. Reeve angled his microphone toward him. "Staff Sergeant Volkov, I respect uniforms. I do. But this committee writes checks for national security, not nostalgia. You stand watch over a monument. That does not entitle your unit to fiscal immunity. Keith waited for the chair's acknowledgement before speaking, voice measured, cadence military and exact. Senator, the duty is continuous by law and by vow. Reducing watch support reduces mission integrity. Reeve gave a short laugh for the cameras. Mission integrity. With respect, Sergeant, this is exactly the rhetorical inflation that makes reform difficult. We're discussing staffing ratios, not sacred mythology. A student in the gallery whispered, "He keeps calling it a show." And his teacher answered under her breath, "Because he's never had to carry what it means." The fatal assumption settled over the room in plain view. Reeve believed Keith's discipline was ornamental. He believed silence meant passivity. He believed a man trained to absorb provocation would never choose a moment to strike with words that could alter the chamber's center of gravity. Most of all, he believed institutional process belonged to people like him alone, and that a sentinel from Arlington was out of place under these lights. At 7:41, Senator Eleanor Ward entered fully through the side corridor and took her seat 2 places down, expression hard as cut granite. She did not interrupt. She read. She flagged lines in Reeve's amendment with a black pen and passed one note to the parliamentarian. Reeve saw the movement and smiled anyway, the smile of someone confident. He had already run the procedural clock too far for reversal. "Chair," he said, "I move immediate distribution of final cards and closure of floor debate on this package." The clerk began to respond, but Ward spoke first, calm and clipped. "Point of order pending. Disclosure sequence appears non-compliant." Reeve did not face her. "Colonel Ward sees ghosts in footnotes." Ward's reply was flat. "I see buried appropriations inside emergency transit language." Murmurs rippled across the benches. Camera operators pivoted, lenses splitting attention between the 2 senators. Reeve finally turned, hands spread in practiced innocence. Nothing was buried. Everything was filed. Kane leaned toward Keith by less than an inch, whispering without moving her lips. "He filed at 2:11 a.m. Supplemental index omitted. Subline C7. Keith gave no visible response. Inside, his threat map expanded again. Aides were moving faster now. Pages crossed behind the public rail with ballot envelopes. Cable runs along the aisle had shifted under hurried shoes. Emma's wheelchair sat near a junction where 2 cords crossed and duct-taped seams had begun to lift at the edges. 3 days earlier, that might have registered as housekeeping. At 7:42, in a crowded federal hearing with tempers rising and camera crews backing for angles, it registered as hazard. Reeve tapped his packet and delivered the line he had come to deliver. "This is why Washington fails. Every trim becomes a morality play. We can honor service without funding costumes indefinitely." The word costumes landed like a slap across generations. The elderly Marine in the Chosin cap pushed himself half upright with both hands on his cane. "That uniform buried my friends," he said, not loudly, but clear enough for 2 rows and 1 live boom mic to catch. An usher touched his shoulder and murmured for calm. He sat back down, breathing harder, eyes wet and furious. Emma looked at Keith, then at the senator, confusion and hurt crossing her face together. "Mama," she whispered, "why is he talking like that?" Her mother swallowed before answering. "Because he doesn't understand yet." At 7:43, the chamber shifted from argument to countdown. Cards moved seat to seat. Reeve's whip-count aide lifted 2 fingers from the side wall, then 3, signaling commitments secured. Ward continued writing, passing a second note forward. The parliamentarian read it, frowned, and spoke into a staff mic with his hand over his mouth. The chair checked the clock. Keith held his posture unchanged, but his nervous system ran at combat tempo beneath the stillness. He tracked Emma's wheel angle relative to the cable seam. He tracked the page approaching from her left with a stack of thick cardstock ballots that blocked peripheral sight lines. He tracked a cameraman stepping backward in the side aisle, shoulder rig high, boot heel searching for floor he wasn't looking at. He tracked Reeve leaning in for one final verbal push, confidence peaking at precisely the moment environments turn unstable. Reeve pointed toward the witness table. "Sit down, toy soldier. Adults are budgeting." The room snapped into silence so complete, the ventilation hum returned like static. Keith did not look at him. He did not blink. He inhaled on a 4 count, exhaled on a 6, and felt his pulse settle lower into his center line. In Kunar, that breath pattern had kept his trigger hand steady while rounds cracked over stone. In Syria, it had kept him functional inside smoke and shouting. In Arlington, it kept his steps exact at midnight rain and noon heat alike. Here, beneath chandeliers and cameras, it kept his judgment clean. By 7:44, the first collected cards were already traveling toward the clerk's station, and Ward had not yet been recognized on her point. The procedural trap was doing what Kane predicted, compressing decision space until outrage would arrive 1 minute late. Reeve sat back, satisfied, jacket unbuttoned, cufflinks flashing each time he moved his wrist. He was close enough to winning that he began rehearsing his post-hearing quote in the margin of his folder. Across from him sat a man who had once carried a wounded interpreter and an American radio operator at the same time through mortar fragmentation. Not because it was heroic, but because leaving either man was never an option. That memory lived in Keith as muscle memory, not narrative. Protect the vulnerable. Stabilize the line. Then speak. A page hurried past Emma's chair, caught his shoe on the raised tape seam, and lurched. He recovered, but his ballot stack tilted into the push handle. The handle jerked. Emma's front caster rolled onto the loose cable loop and stuck at an angle. The next bump came from behind as another aide pivoted to avoid the cameraman. The chair tipped forward toward the marble step at the rail break. Time slowed to separate frames. Emma's mother reached first, fingers catching only blanket. The page gasped and grabbed air. The cameraman froze mid-step, rig still high. Kane was already half out of her seat. Keith moved. He rose in one controlled surge, crossed the witness gap in 2 strides, and placed one white-gloved hand on the wheelchair frame just above the right wheel lock, the exact leverage point that arrested forward momentum without flipping the chair backward. His left forearm braced the armrest, his boots planted wide. The chair stopped inches from the step edge and settled level. Emma stared up at him, shocked but unhurt, patrol cap still in her lap. "It's all right," Keith said, voice low, steady. He did not release the frame until he felt the wheel fully stabilized, and Emma's mother had both hands secure on the handles. Then he straightened and turned toward the dais, shoulders squared, jaw set, expression carved back to discipline. The chamber remained frozen around him, every face drawn to the line he had just crossed, and the child he had just kept safe. Reeve stood halfway, anger replacing polish. "You do not leave the witness position without recognition. Sit down." Keith held his gaze for one measured second. When he spoke, the words landed clean enough to cut through cameras, procedure, and ego alike. "Senator, you can audit a budget, but you do not audit the dead." No one spoke. No one shuffled paper. Even the reporters stopped typing. At 7:45, Ward rose. Voice-carrying command learned far from this chamber. "Madam Chair, immediate ruling. The witness acted to prevent injury. My point of order is now and on record. Subline C7 violates disclosure and germaneness. The parliamentarian stood with a folder already open. The ranking member is correct. The amendment's tomb allocations were materially obscured within emergency transit text. Under Committee Rule 12, vote cannot proceed on current language. Reeve turned to his counsel, face tight. Fix it. Counsel whispered back. Cannot end session without unanimous consent. Ward did not let the beat breathe. Then strike C7, restore full ceremonial staffing, restore overnight maintenance, and explicitly protect youth access transport. Recorded revote. The chair looked from parliamentarian to clerk, then brought the gavel down once. So ordered. Previous cards void. New language will be distributed. A sound moved through the gallery. Not cheering. Not yet, but the release of a nation-sized breath held too long. The elderly Marine closed his eyes and bowed his head. Emma's mother pressed her forehead briefly to her daughter's hair. Colonel Kane sat back down slowly, hands steady again. Keith returned to the witness table and resumed his original posture as if the movement had cost him nothing. Inside, adrenaline receded in disciplined stages, each breath bringing pulse and thought back into alignment. Externally, he was stone again, a sentinel in dress blues under hard lights, white gloves unmarked, eyes forward, waiting for the institution to decide whether it still recognized sacred duty when it stood in front of it. Inside, the echo of his own sentence still moved through him like a struck bell. He had spoken only once, and the room was still vibrating from it. Across the gallery, people remained suspended in that same instant. Emma's fingers were locked around the armrest now, the patrol cap pinned safely beneath her forearm. Her mother kept one hand on the wheelchair handle and one across Emma's shoulder blades, feeling, through wool and cotton, that her daughter was breathing steadily again. The elderly Marine near the aisle had risen half an inch without realizing it, as if his body had answered an old command before his mind caught up. 3 high school students in borrowed blazers sat with pens hovering over paper, but none of them wrote. A television producer lowered her headset from one ear and whispered almost reverently, "Keep rolling. Do not cut away." Reeve had ordered him to sit down. Keith had sat. But the hierarchy had shifted anyway. The senator's jaw worked once, then set. His cufflinks flashed as he shuffled his packet, searching for procedural footing, trying to force the chamber back into numbers and subclauses where he was strongest. "Madam Chair," he said, and the smoothness had gone brittle at the edges. "This hearing is becoming theatrical. We had an unfortunate near accident. It was handled. We can proceed to vote." Ward did not raise her voice. She did not need to. "We proceed under rules, not momentum." The parliamentarian remained standing, one hand on the open folder, the other on a marked copy of committee protocol. For clarity on the record, the challenge subline altered appropriations for tomb sentinel operations, overnight plaza preservation, and military youth transport access. Those changes were not disclosed in the required summary table. Reeve leaned toward his counsel. Table omission is clerical. The parliamentarian looked directly at the chair. It is substantive. The word landed harder than a gavel. By 7:46, aides who had been moving like sprinters slowed to a measured pace. The clerk collected voided vote cards in 2 gray trays and set tamper seals across the tops, while cameras captured every motion. That visual, boring to most citizens on most days, became crucial in this room. Paper trail, chain of custody, institutional correction in real time. Colonel Kane watched those trays with the focus of a commander overseeing munitions transfer, and when a junior staffer reached for one too early, she cleared her throat once. The staffer withdrew his hand immediately. At the witness table, Keith's heartbeat had settled into a disciplined rhythm. He tracked the room without turning his head. He saw Emma's front caster now clear of the cable. He saw an usher kneel and tape the seam flat with fresh strips, then test it with his own shoe twice before standing. He saw the cameraman, who had nearly backed into the rush lane, lower his rig and step away from the public rail with a face gone pale. No one needed to announce the lesson. It had already been learned. Reeve tried once more. I request immediate closure and revised vote by voice. Ward's reply came fast and precise. Denied. Recorded vote only. The public deserves names beside choices. A murmur moved through the gallery, then disciplined itself into silence again. The chair nodded. Recorded vote. New language to be read in full. The clerk began, voice steady over the microphone. Amendment text as revised. Restoration of full ceremonial staffing levels for the United States Army Old Guard Tomb Sentinels. Full funding for overnight maintenance and preservation of the Tomb Plaza infrastructure. Protected funding stream for youth access transport, including school and Gold Star family visitation programming. Compliance review attached as appendix. Every phrase stripped camouflage away from what had been hidden. No more transit euphemisms, no more soft labels. Plain meaning in public record. Reeve stared at the amended page while the clerk read, and for the first time since the hearing opened, he looked like a man hearing consequences arrive in his own language. Colonel Kane lifted her folder. Madam Chair, point of documentation. Stated. Kane stood, retired rank still present in her spine. At 2:11 a.m., supplemental index upload omitted C7 from the disclosure grid. I have authenticated copies of both the upload receipt and the red line comparison. I request inclusion in the hearing record. The chair extended a hand. Submit. Kane passed the packet to an usher who walked to the dais. Physical evidence introduced, logged, and placed under seal. No loose ends, no speculation. Reeves' counsel whispered urgently, tapping a statute citation with his pen. Reeves shook his head once, too sharp, and pushed the pen away. Ward watched him with the expression of someone who had seen this pattern before in different uniforms and different arenas. Overreach, assumption, sudden collapse. Senator Reeves, she said, you used emergency transit language to obscure cuts to the nation's most visible military memorial duty. Do you contest the parliamentarian's ruling? He looked toward the cameras before answering, not toward Ward. I contest the characterization. Do you contest the ruling? A pause. Then no. The gallery exhaled as one body, not cheering. Release. At 7:52, the recorded vote began. Senators answered in turn, each name followed by a single word into the microphone. Aye. No. Aye. The cadence was almost liturgical in its own way, austere and binding. A freshman senator who had entered the morning aligned with Reeve glanced once toward the public rail, saw Emma still clutching her father's cap, and changed his answer from what his aide had penciled on a note card. Aye, he said clearly. The clerk looked up, confirmed, wrote it down. Reeve cast no, clipped and cold. Ward cast aye, voice flat with command. When the clerk finished, she passed the tally slip to the chair. The chair read once, then again, then handed it to the parliamentarian for confirmation. By recorded vote, the chair announced, the revised amendment is adopted. Funding is restored as read. Additional preservation and youth access protections are approved. This time the sound that rose from the gallery could not be contained. It was not a shout, it was a surge, a collective impact of relief and pride and anger, finding lawful release. Veterans stood first, almost by reflex, then families, then students, some with tears they did not bother hiding. Emma looked up at her mother with wet eyes and asked, "We still get to come?" Her mother nodded, unable to answer for a second. "Yes, baby. Yes." Reeve remained seated, lips pressed into a line, fingers flattening the edge of his folder, until the paper bowed. Ward was not finished. "Madam Chair, one further matter." The room quieted again. The witness was publicly demeaned in this chamber while under oath, and his duty was misrepresented before military families in attendance. I move that Senator Reeve issue a corrective statement now, on camera, as part of the official record. Reeve snapped his head toward her. "That is not required." The chair looked to the parliamentarian. He answered without hesitation. "Corrective statements are within committee authority when materially misleading assertions are entered during proceedings." Ward held Reeve's gaze. "Then let the record be corrected." For a long second he did not move. He had built his career on never yielding ground in public. Yet the vote board stood against him. The documentation was sealed, and every lens in the chamber was pointed directly at his face. Purchased influence had carried him to the brink. Earned authority had stopped him at the line. He rose. "My earlier remarks," he said, each word visibly selected and disliked, "characterizing Staff Sergeant Volkov and Tomb Sentinel duty as ceremonial excess were inappropriate. I withdraw them." His throat tightened on the next clause. "The mission is a lawful and honored obligation. I respect the service represented." He sat before the silence fully settled. No one applauded. That restraint mattered more than applause. It made clear this was not a spectacle. It was correction. Keith remained composed at the table, eyes forward, expression unchanged. But Ward turned toward him and gave one brief nod. Officer to soldier, acknowledgement without theater. Kane saw it and let out a breath she had been holding since dawn. The chair gave final instructions. Revised appropriation language moves to full committee this afternoon, with compliance annotation attached. Archived footage will include the corrective statement and ruling transcript. Another thread closed. External process, documented outcome, on-record consequence. As staff began orderly collection, the observer currents in the room shifted from confrontation to witness. The students resumed writing, this time quickly, trying to capture exact wording before memory blurred it. The elderly Marine wiped his eyes with the heel of his palm and then straightened his cap. The cameraman who had stumbled approached Emma's mother at a respectful distance and said, "Ma'am, I'm sorry for the rush by your row." She nodded once. "Just watch your step next time." He did. Emma looked toward Keith until he finally turned his head by a fraction. Enough for her to know he had seen her. She raised a careful salute again, fingers aligned better than they had been on the hill. Keith answered with the slightest inclination of his chin, formal and precise, then returned to stillness. The chamber lights remained harsh, the wood still scarred by decades of hearings, the microphones still ordinary machines. Yet the prevailing atmosphere had changed, not softer, but clearer. Procedure had done what it was meant to do when people with courage used it correctly. The line between sacred duty and political convenience had been tested in full view and redrawn in law. When the gavel struck adjournment, it sounded less like an ending than a reaffirmation. In that room, on that morning, a sentinel had broken protocol once to protect a child, spoken once to defend the dead, and then surrendered the rest to institutions capable of honor when pushed to remember it. When the gavel's echo finally died in the high chamber ceiling, process took over with the same stern choreography Keith respected on the mat. The clerk locked the 2 gray trays of voided vote cards, read the seal numbers aloud for the record, and handed them to a records officer in Navy gloves. Colonel Kane's documentation packet was stamped, logged as Exhibit 14C, and carried to archival intake with the upload receipt and red line comparison clipped in order. At the dais, the parliamentarian signed the ruling transcript and directed staff to attach the compliance annotation before the afternoon full committee transfer. Nothing that had happened would be left to memory alone. Ward stepped down from the dais and stopped at Keith's table. Up close, she looked less like a senator than what she was underneath the title, a reserve colonel who had spent years in rooms where one sentence too late became a casualty report. "Staff Sergeant Volkov," she said, formal but warm. "Your restraint honored the uniform." Keith rose. "Ma'am, you moved when protection required it. You spoke when truth required it." He held her gaze. "I was on duty." Ward gave one short nod, the kind that closed a report. "So was I." Behind them, Reeves stood near the side exit, while two microphones waited for him. He delivered the same corrective language again for the press pool, clipped and controlled, then left without looking back. The loaded glance he had shared earlier with his counsel paid off in full now. Not strategy, but surrender to the record he could not bend. By 8:19, the public gallery had thinned to clusters of veterans, students, and staff gathering coats, folders, and composure. The elderly Marine in the chosen cap reached Keith first, cane planted, chin lifted. "Sergeant," he said, voice rough with age and conviction, "you held the line." Keith answered in the cadence of service. "Thank you, sir." The Marine's wife touched Keith's sleeve once with careful fingertips. He was trying to stand before the vote was called. Arthritis won that round. Pride didn't. A faint change moved across Keith's face. Not quite a smile, but close enough to register. He stood where it counted. Emma waited with both hands on her father's folded patrol cap. The fright from the near fall had drained from her eyes, replaced by concentration. "Staff Sergeant," she said, each word deliberate. "I kept my salute straight this time." "You did," Keith said. Her mother took a breath that trembled once and then steadied. "I owe you an apology. In there, when the chair tipped, I froze." "No apology, ma'am. You were with your daughter." Emma lifted the cap slightly. "Can I still come watch at night someday?" Ward answered from a step behind, hearing the question as she checked a message on her phone. "You won't lose that program. The full committee clerk just confirmed transfer with protections intact." She turned the screen so Emma's mother could read the header line. "Funding language accepted. For afternoon calendar, compliance attached. External contact, resolved in writing." Colonel Kane joined them, folder now thin, work complete. "And the safety report from this morning is filed," she added, glancing toward the taped cable seam still visible near the rail. "No more loose runs in public lanes during active session. That detail won't be ignored again." The cameraman who had stumbled approached, rig hanging at his side, posture humble. "Staff Sergeant, ma'am," he said to Emma's mother, "I already submitted my incident statement. I should have cleared the lane earlier." Keith gave him a level look. "Then you corrected it?" "Yes, Sergeant. Do it right next time." "I will." At the chamber doors, one of the interns who had whispered half a sentence earlier stood waiting for Kane with a legal pad full of cramped notes. "Colonel, that C7 line," he said. "I thought it was routine transit language." Kane took the pad, drew a box around one paragraph, and handed it back. "That's why disclosure rules exist. Hidden text is still text. You either read every line, or someone else writes your values for you." The intern nodded, chastened and educated in the same breath. By 11:47, Keith was back across the river in a quiet prep room at Arlington. The hearing's noise replaced by ritual. He removed the travel gloves, inspected seams, reset the kepi angle by measured degrees, checked brass reflection against neutral light, and pressed one stubborn cuff edge until it lay flat. The evening watch would begin at 1700, and standards did not lower for political victory. They tightened. Outside the window, November had sharpened. The wind cut cleaner now, carrying the dry scent of leaves and cold stone. At 2:36 p.m., while Keith reviewed final uniform lines, the full committee feed came through on a wall monitor in the administrative office. The revised language passed without amendment. The chair entered the corrected hearing transcript, Reeves' retraction, Kane's exhibit, and the parliamentarian's ruling into the permanent record. Youth access transport was protected as a named allocation, not a discretionary footnote. Night maintenance funds were restored in full. Ceremonial staffing remained intact. Physical evidence accounted for, external process completed, institutional memory locked. The sun was dropping by the time visitors gathered again near the tomb plaza. Cold settled over the hill in a fine metallic layer, and breath became visible above coats and scarves. Headstones in the descending rows caught a pale, amber light before fading toward gray. The crowd included many from the morning and several from the hearing. The Marine and his wife, the civics teacher with her students, the one-armed veteran with his sister, reporters now silent off camera, and Emma in her wheelchair beside her mother, patrol cap still in her lap, blanket folded square. At 4:58, the relief sequence began. Boots sounded on stone with measured authority. Keith emerged in full dress, 6'2" and unflinching, face carved into disciplined calm, jaw scar a thin, pale line when he turned through the light. His uniform was immaculate, every crease sharp enough to cut glass, white gloves pristine against the M14, boots polished to a mirror shine that caught the last band of sunset. The tomb's marble face stood luminous and severe, wreaths carved in shadow and light, unchanged by hearings, headlines, or ambition. He stepped onto the black mat, heel strike, cadence set, 21 steps, pause, turn, repeat. The hill answered with silence. No speeches followed him. No one needed narration. Veterans squared shoulders that age had rounded. Teenagers who had spent the afternoon replaying clips on their phones lowered them now and watched with both hands still. A father in a work jacket bent to his son and counted quietly, losing track, starting again. The son copied him. Nearby, the elderly Marine raised a salute that trembled only at the wrist, not at the elbow, and held it through Keith's full pass across center line. Emma watched every step like a student reading scripture. On Keith's third turn, she raised her right hand, fingers aligned, thumb tucked, wrist straight. It was not perfect parade form, but it was true. Keith reached the north mark, paused, turned back, and gave the smallest possible acknowledgement on the return passage, a fractional shift in bearing that told her he had seen it and accepted it. Her mother whispered, "He noticed." Emma did not lower her hand until he completed the next turn. "I know." The flag above the plaza moved in steady intervals against the darkening sky. Wind crossed the hill and lifted coat hems, then settled. At 5:12, plaza lights came on in soft pools along the walkway, and the marble took on that evening glow unique to Arlington. Less bright than dawn, more enduring. Keith's steps did not vary by a half-inch. Ritual continued with mechanical precision and human weight, the living answer to every argument that memory could be trimmed like overhead. Colonel Kane stood 2 rows back with Ward, who had arrived without staff fanfare, and removed her coat gloves before the ceremony began. "You were right this morning," Ward murmured. Kane kept her eyes on the mat. About what? About language being a flank. Kane nodded once. And about sentinels seeing it early. Ward watched Keith complete another pass. The country keeps relearning the same lesson. Then we keep teaching it. By full dusk, the headstones had become pale markers in ordered darkness, each one a quiet witness. The crowd thinned respectfully, families departing in low voices, students lingering for one last look before following their teacher down the path. The Marine and his wife left arm in arm. Emma's mother adjusted the blanket, turned the wheelchair slowly, then paused when Emma looked back one final time. Keith was at center line, motion exact, eyes fixed on a point beyond any single person. Emma raised a last salute from the path. Keith reached his mark, paused in measured stillness, and turned into the next passage without breaking cadence. That was his answer and his vow. Duty without applause, remembrance without season, honor carried in silence. Boots clicked on marble beneath the flag. 21 steps, pause, turn, repeat. The tomb stood white against the night. The rows of headstones stretched into darkness like a formation at rest, and the sacred was not merely preserved, but guarded exactly as promised.